Welcome to the video version of our Never Stay Dead podcast. You watching it on YouTube get the unedited version. We'll edit it down. It'll be slightly more intelligent and less retarded.
All right.
On the podcast itself. Like things like that would be edited right out.
There you go.
But you will get to see the cute little pictures there. In fact, people watching this on video, let me know if this way we've done the last few times where we sit next to the pictures here while we talk about them, if that helps, if that makes it more worth watching these podcasts that shouldn't really be on YouTube.
And let me know if you want more of my face or what's needed there.
So people are clamoring for more face.
Right. So, Damian, what are we talking about today?
Well, I'm going to announce that when the podcast officially begins.
Oh, okay.
So I'll just dive in then. Although those people viewing can probably guess by what's on the screen. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Never Stay Dead, where we seem to be obsessed by the X-Men. By my count, this is either our 5th or 6th episode where we talk about the X-Men in one form or another.
Is it?
Yes. So I am Damian. I'm joined by my magnificent buddy, Matt.
Yeah, puzzled right now. I remember us talking a bit about Hoxpox, and then I'm trying to remember.
We did Hoxpox. We did the Neil Adams X-Men. We did
right.
X-Men Grand Design. X-Men Grand Design. It was your choice.
Grand Design.
That was that thing by Ed Piskor that covered all of X-Men history.
Yeah.
Well, that's 3. Oof. I could have sworn there was another one.
My dementia's setting in.
I thought there was even another X-Men that we covered, but maybe this is just our 4th time talking about the X-Men.
So, yeah.
So this time it was my idea. After my previous X-Men idea being a total belly flop for Matt, but I still enjoyed it a lot, reading the Roy Thomas, Neil Adams X-Men. And that just had me obsessed with, what came next, which is the very first issue is Len Wein, and then it's the Chris Claremont X-Men when they revived. They brought us the new, what do we call these? The new X-Men?
At the time, it was the new X-Men. Since then, that's become like an actual on the cover title.
Right, so it confuses things. It's
X-Men. It's confusing.
It's the X-Men second wave, which still in a sense is rolling. The wave is still going. Everything is built somehow on these books.
The next generation, the real start of the X-Men. There's something really funny to me, though, coming back to this now.
Yes.
Because this is giant size X-Men #1. And for the longest time, I thought it was because, this is a big start, a rebirth for the X-Men, basically.
Right.
They're coming off this weird reprint status, and there's all these new characters. And it was this big deal in my mind. I didn't realize that there was just giant size Marvel, giant size Spider-Mans, giant size Avengers, or whatever. I didn't know those existed.
This was a period. So let's just back up and say, for those listening, that we are going to cover giant size X-Men and then X-Men 94 through 98, I think it is. The first 5, or maybe the first 8 issues. Maybe we'll go to 100. So the first chunk of issues from this revived X-Men. So at this time, Marvel was doing a whole series of giant size comics because throughout the 70s, comics were rapidly losing sales on the newsstands. And one of the perceived issues was comics had too low of a profit margin. So they tried to do more expensive comics. DC did the same thing in their own fashion. So there was, at some point in the mid-70s, there was this huge spate of giant-sized comics, giant-sized Spider-Man, Conan, Dracula, what have you. And they'd planned to do an ongoing giant-sized X-Men originally, but they only ended up doing this one issue. It's
It's
not
funny
clear
you say
why.
Dracula, because the first Spider-Man Giant Size had Dracula in it, and they kind of were on the same ship, but never actually fully met. It's a
Oh, that's
super
funny.
weird comic. Yeah.
I think it's because Dracula was a big selling comic at the time, and they just wanted to help juice sales for everybody.
Again, I know this now, but it's so funny to me because for the longest time, the idea that Dracula was in the Marvel Universe was this weird oddity to me of the
Right.
past. I didn't realize
Yeah.
it was a whole run, a whole deal. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you thought it was like a one-time he happens to show up in a Spider-Man comic.
Well, I knew it was here and there, and I knew for the longest time. The first time I heard about Dracula in Marvel was with the X-Men with Storm. So
does she encounter? I don't recall that anymore.
it's an annual number
Or
3
perhaps
or
I never
4,
read it.
I think. Dracula possesses Storm, and so she becomes one of Dracula's. What's the word? I don't know, but she's a subject of Dracula, and then they
Right.
deal
One
with
of
that.
his. Yeah, I know there's a word for it, but I can't think of it. Succubi or something like that. It's kind of
I
a
thought
disturbing
succubus
sounding
was a
word.
different thing.
In any case, yeah, I mean, Dracula had a 70-issue run, and at least critically, it was one of the most beloved of Marvel's horror comics, and they constantly had him cross over with. I'm not sure if he crossed over with Howard the Duck or not, but just about everybody else,
had
maybe
to.
even Howard the Duck.
You know, that's funny because I heard it sucked. Sorry.
Well, as you will find out next time you visit me, and I hit you over the head with a artist edition of Giant Size, or not, of Dracula, Tomb of Dracula.
I think that's
and I have
Prime.
some Tomb of Dracula original art, so you can tell I thought it sucked.
All right.
But we're way in the weeds now. So yeah, it is confusing looking back. There's this one special issue of the X-Men. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, do you know if there was like a Giant Size 2 X-Men?
I believe there was a Giant Size 2 X-Men that had reprints, because at some point they decided to take the story that Len Wein and Dave Cockrum had already been working on and split it in half and put it in the first 2 issues of the 94 and 95 are originally Giant Size X-Men #2.
Oh, that's weird.
And so I think what happened, I'm guessing, because if you look at 94, it says plot, and 95 say they're plotted by Len Wein. And if you remember the Marvel method of the 60s and 70s, someone came up with a plot, gave it to the artist drew it, then usually the same person, but not always, someone came and added the dialogue and made the story make full sense. So Chris Claremont, I presume, was just coming in after it was all drawn and writing the dialogue of those first 2 issues.
That's so funny, because I was going to say it didn't really feel kind of like any vestige of what I remember of Claremont until we started getting to like 96.
So you're very astute then, without even knowing it.
Well, without looking at the credits carefully enough, I guess. But yeah.
Well, and it's confusing. I mean, it's possible, because I've read Chris Claremont saying that he was working as an assistant to Len Wein, and he was there at the plotting sessions in the office with Cockrum and Len Wein. So he may have had some involvement in the plotting, but they don't give him plotting credit, just scripting credit.
But this was his first gig, right?
I don't think so, but I don't know. I haven't researched what was the very first comic he wrote.
Okay.
But he was, back then, your route to becoming a writer was to work in the office and eventually get your shot at writing various things. So I think he'd been writing things here and there, and this might have been one of his first regular gigs. But I haven't looked into that at all, because he wrote a lot of comics in the 70s, not just the X-Men.
Yeah, but I mean, once you get to
for
the
instance,
80s,
he
like
was
all
writing
X-Men.
Iron Fist, and he was writing Ms. Marvel. Maybe all of that came after Giant Size X-Men.
I mean, he wrote some of that, but it's usually like an issue here or there. It wasn't like a run.
I'd have to go back and look. There are short runs, but I think he was. I recall reading Marvel team-ups by him, but again, I don't know.
He did
which
have a
came
stint
first.
on Marvel Team Up for a while, which is fun because that's the only real Spider-Man he ever did. But with like Iron Fist, like I think it was in Marvel Premiere when it took them like 6 issues to get through the full extended amount of Iron Fist's origin. Claremont only wrote like 2 issues of that.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's funny because I associate him and John Byrne with Iron Fist, and I thought that's how John Byrne ended up on the X-Men later because he'd already worked with Cockrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's that very well could have been, but it wasn't like a long time. It was only a handful of issues.
Right. Well, you know, people like to think that big, long. I'm typing while talking. People like to think that big, long runs were common in the 70s, but I think there was a huge amount of musical chairs, and especially in the writing positions. Often the artist would stay a lot longer than the writers. And there's only a few writers that actually had long runs in the 70s.
But that's also kind of symptomatic of the thing itself, right? Like once you're in and you're on a long run, that's great. But I mean, then you're taking up, however many issues, like 30 issues over 3 years or whatever it is. But if you're jumping around for a bit, you're going to jump around across all these books. And so that's going to be the status quo for most people until they find their groove or whatever it is.
So according to Wikipedia, Claremont's first professional scripting assignment, whatever that means, because that could be plot and script or just the script,
right,
was Daredevil and Black Widow 102 in 1973. And then his first regular comics writing was Iron Fist in Marvel Premiere, starting in issue 23 in 1975. So that's 2 years later. He was joined 2 issues later by artist John Byrne. The Claremont Byrne team continued to work together on the character for 15 issues, it looked like.
Yeah. That's weird. I definitely noticed.
He must have written Giant Size Fantastic Four in February of 1975.
Yep. I'm seeing that Madrox, which is crazy.
Right.
Because that's one of my favorite characters, and I didn't know he actually created him too.
And was he a mutant at first? A lot of characters will not. I mean, I have no idea because I haven't read the first appearance of Madrox in so long. But a lot of characters will not be mutants at first, and then later we'll find out they're mutants.
I mean, if they're not really going over the origin, I guess it's an easy way to kind of sidestep it.
Right.
I remember in an interview.
Anyway, so he'd been writing a bit here, but this was not. The other thing to remember is X-Men was not a big gig.
Mm-hmm.
There was talk about making an international group that would sell better to the international markets, and that's why they made up this version of the X-Men. And they had Dave Cockrum, who apparently had designed a lot of characters before that he was going to use at the Legion of Superheroes, and they didn't want them, and he left DC. There's your favorite group again. The Legion of Superheroes is closely tied to the X-Men.
Yeah, but the rejects from the Legion suddenly become great heroes. Remember the world around elsewhere. They just have to be let loose of the clutches of Bouncing Boy and Super Lad. Or
clearly, DC made a mistake not taking up Dave Cockrum on his offer of characters like Nightcrawler, and I think there's another character who isn't Storm but has the same costume. And
there's a few characters that kind of
maybe
like
Thunderbird
had storms. Yeah, but was it just the designs of the characters?
I think some were designs and some were a little more than the design, like some powers, ideas, and stuff. I'm not clear. It would be great to have kind of one of those books that like each chapter tells you everything you need to know about every X-Men book. But maybe that's such a thing.
I actually might own that book, and it might be sitting on that shelf right behind me. I just haven't poured through all of it yet. There's a book I have that's just interviews with like X-Men creators.
Right.
So maybe I should.
Yeah, because I'd love to. The annotations of all the characters would be great to have.
Yeah. Especially this group. I mean, what a swing and a hit, like.
But if you look at them, like on the splash page, let me go on the splash page of their first appearance,
Okay.
This is
Oh,
there we go.
ads. Okay, here we go.
They kind of look a bit like the Legion of Superheroes, each with their own garish outfit, and that they have that Legion of Superheroes vibe to me. I hate to rub it in, but
well, I just don't see it, but I don't know.
and then, of course, later in issues that we're not covering today, there's the Shiar. What are they called? The Royal Guard. Which are really a take. They really are Cockrum redoing the Legion of Superheroes. There's a lot of one-to-one characters there.
That helps make a lot of sense to me, because I thought it was so bizarre that you get X-Men and this whole mutants thing, and then they're like Star Wars,
Right.
What?
Well, Star Wars was another best-selling comic at the time. Was Star Wars out actually when Claremont? I think it's which issue? It's like in.
Sounds right to me.
There's one issue where the first issue where they sort of start showing the Shi'ar without saying who they are is issue number 97. What year was that? So as I was saying, this was not a big deal. It was one of many giant size they threw out there. And when they revived it as a regular ongoing comic, they made it bi-monthly. So it only came out 6 times a year.
What was the space between Giant Size X-Men 1 and 94?
Unfortunately, the table of contents in my omnibus doesn't give a date for Giant Size X-Men number 1. 94 came out in August of 75.
Okay.
And then the first appearance of the Shi'ar, the Unnamed Shiar, was in February of 76. I don't think Star Wars was out then. Star Wars might have just been out. I'm not sure.
So Giant Size says it was, wait, hold on. This ain't right. May 75.
Okay, so
so like 3 months, that's space.
3 months, yeah. It was some time. They were thinking about it in the bullpen, what to do with the X-Men.
Yeah. So I gotta say, Beast looks weird there.
What are you looking at in the splash page?
Yeah.
Yeah, he looks very weird. Dave Cockrum is the artist on all the issues we're talking about, and he's obviously a pivotal player in the early creation, but he's an odd artist. Sometimes he draws beautifully and sometimes he draws ugly, or at least that's my take on him. And it can vary from panel to panel. There's these beautiful splash pages and then these horrible ones. Or in this case, most of these characters are drawn well, but Beast looks really bad. So does Iceman, kind of, but Beast in particular.
Yeah, and it's funny, we get the second look of Wolverine already, and I don't know.
Yeah, I can't. So how has he changed from his Hulk appearances?
In the Hulk appearance, he has like these really thin, I guess, flares.
Those flares around his eyes.
And they have more of like the whisker look.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And I swear his claws are shorter in Hulk.
Well, and I find throughout all the issues we've read, they never define Wolverine's powers or what about him as a mutant.
They don't really. I don't feel like they do that until they actually Claremont sits down, basically makes Wolverine the protagonist of X-Men for the most part, which he was for a few years, basically, once they kick Cyclops to the curb for a while, which is kind of even weirder to me now, having read these issues preceding it.
Yeah. Well, so let me just really try to quickly go over the plot or the basic structure of Giant Size X-Men, then we can give more opinions on it. But basically, it starts with a gathering of the heroes. We see each hero for a certain amount of space. Most people maybe get a page or a little less, but Nightcrawler gets 3 pages, and that's probably the best introduction of any of the characters. Yeah. That's my opinion. He gets 3 pages, then Wolverine gets 2 pages. Storm gets maybe Banshee, who is supposed to be older, I guess, than the others. He gets 2 panels. He's recruited in 2 panels. So each one, Professor X appears to them and says, "Come join me. We've got to save the world together. And plus, I can teach you things." And then Storm has a very kind of visually cool, but with little explanation of who she is thing, where Professor Xavier shows up and she says, "All right, I'll come with you." Then Sunfire gets a few panels, and he basically just seems really angry. You require help that only I may give. So I owe you nothing, Professor, but perhaps I owe something to myself. Perhaps it's time once more for the world to hear from Sunfire. And then he comes.
He reminds me of early Quicksilver.
Yes, because Quicksilver was such an angry, pissed off character all the time. I always liked that about him. And then Peter Rasputin, is that his name? Last name? Rasputin?
Yeah.
Colossus gets recruited. It seemed particularly dicey to me why he would go off with Professor X from a Russian commune, but
they addressed that in 50 or so issues.
Okay. And then Thunderbird is recruited, and he is established as this very angry character, as Native Americans might have a right to be.
You just think everyone's so mad.
I think that's a good thing. But for a story. But he decides he wants to come along to prove himself, I guess.
I got more cocky from him than angry, I guess.
Okay.
And
you can stuff a cactus, Custer. The white man needs me. That's tough. I owe him nothing but the grief he's given my people. That's where I got the anger from.
I mean, that's fair.
He is cocky also.
Yeah, well, we'll see that in a couple issues.
Yes, we will see the cockiness. And then in chapter 2, the splash page, I guess I should be moving this forward.
This isn't, because I know it's the first appearance for a number of these characters, but it's not, this isn't Banshee's first appearance, right?
No, Banshee appeared in, I think in the early X-Men, the 20s or so. I don't know if he was identified as a mutant or not. And he was like hypnotized by another bad guy, and he attacked the X-Men, but at the end of the issue we found out he was being brain controlled, and he and Professor X were going to work together, and I don't know if that was ever followed up on. I couldn't find
it. Here we are.
Well, yes. So I really liked, of all of these in this first issue, it feels like Nightcrawler is the standout. I mean, Storm should be, and I know she will be as time goes on. But
I mean, Nightcrawler's a big one, and I agree with you. I thought Colossus's, worked pretty well for me.
I guess, yeah, that didn't work as well for me. He certainly is a cool character on a visual level, that he turns into solid steel or whatever it is he turns into. Thunderbird and Wolverine's powers are vague.
Well, wasn't Wolverine's more defined in Hulk, so that maybe they didn't feel
I suppose so. I need to go back and read those Hulks. I feel so bitter about that, having owned those issues as a kid and lost them. But because I could be, a billionaire. The weird thing about, actually going back to Wolverine, the weird thing about Wolverine is he just says, I'm going to stop working for the whatever, the army or the Secret Service in Canada. Goodbye. Here, I cut up your shirt and I'm gone. Where is he? And he says, oh, it beats just sitting around here waiting for my next mission. That, I don't know. There's a lot of this to me that is just the childlike logic of less sophisticated comics that allows these characters, particularly Wolverine, as for me, a very strong case. This doesn't really make sense from an adult point of view of how the world works.
I think it's telling that they went back to most of these characters to basically this point and made a bigger issue about every one of them later. So I don't think you're wrong, but I also feel like without this more childish moment here, getting to it, we
Right.
maybe would have never gotten there. It's kind of
right. Len
it's
Wein
kind
is
of that
just getting
balance.
things done. This is what you do in the comics. You got to gather the heroes and introduce them. And so this was a quick and dirty way. We've seen it time and time again. A leader who goes around and appears to different people and says, "Come join me in my group."
Yeah.
So I wasn't horribly bothered by it, but since we're reading it now more critically than when it came out, in a sense. And I can imagine all of this stuff bugged Chris Claremont as he progressed as a writer, and that's probably why it was all revisited, as you've mentioned. But I kind of, with my stronger memories of the X-Men are from the very late 70s and the early 80s. Everything seemed much more believable by then to me. We'll see when I get to those, because I plan to reread the whole Chris Claremont run.
Yeah, I'm sure Chris Claremont's talked about this at some point, but I wonder if he's really angry or if he viewed it more as like, and now he had time to get there. Because very clearly, like, the X-Men were a throwaway. This issue just kind of had to be done as a shot in the dark to make it happen.
Right.
And
no, they made an editorial decision. We need this team made up of an international group. Let's make it the X-Men. How do we quickly throw it together?
Yeah.
And it's weird because Len Wein has been the creator of major characters. Wolverine, Swamp Thing are the two that jump to mind as characters I've loved at many times in my reading experience.
Man-Thing?
I think that was Gary Conway or Roy Thomas.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure. Or maybe even Marv Wolfman. I'm not sure. But anyway, Len Wein has done a lot of great stuff in terms of things that went on to be great, but I don't ever remember loving a comic written by Len Wein. And maybe that's sacrilege on my part. I don't know. Yeah. I never, as a kid, he was always someone who I viewed as okay. Like, I would get excited if there was a Doug Moench comic or a Bill Mantlo comic or a Roy Thomas comic. I would not get excited when there was a Len Wein comic, but I would not throw it away. I would not turn it down either.
I mean, I hear you. I have a super soft spot for Giant Size X-Men 1. There's just something kind of like fun and happening with it. And even I remember reading this as a kid a number of times, and even then thinking like, this is kind of hokey, but also kind of realizing like, I wanted more here or there, but thinking like, okay, well, if they did everything I was thinking of, this book would be, this big. And I was thinking, well, yeah, that'd be great. But also, they can only do so much with an issue. So I don't know.
Yeah, and in a way, they even point out the flaws in all of this. Like, the characters don't really want to come with Professor X, but then they do anyway. And then when they put on their costumes, they say, well, actually, they say they've never seen costumes like this, but I feel like they're almost pointing out that the costumes are kind of silly looking. And I never knew that the X-Men's costumes were constructed from unstable molecules, just like the Fantastic Fours. But anyway, so that was an interesting.
I don't know if that's held up as canon because they get torn apart a lot.
Yes. That's a good point, especially Wolverines, right?
And Cyclops a lot, yeah.
So then the plot develops that the X-Men, the original X-Men, went off to this island after Cerebro found a incredibly Cerebro, the device that finds mutants around the world, found an incredibly powerful mutant on this island. So the original X-Men flew off to the island, and something horrible happened, and only Scott Summers' Cyclops returned, but with no memory of what had happened. And that's why Professor X has recruited a new team, so they can all go back to this island and rescue the X-Men. Which, again, because I had my critical hat on rather than reading this as a child, I'm like, wait a minute, he just told everyone we need to save the world. Now it turns out we just need to save our fellow X-Men. Now he turns out to be right by the end of the comic. This saved the world, or maybe it saved the world. But
yeah. Well,
So there's just a lot of stuff where you have to just sort of give it to them. Okay, so this is just
a little hyperbole never hurt
right.
the motivation.
So they go to the island. As always, I think their airplane blows up. Does it? Maybe not.
It gets swallowed, I thought.
Oh, maybe that's it. Anyway, they go down to the island and they eventually discover that the island is a living island, that all the different things on the island came together and kind of mutated, but not like a human mutation. It's more like a Gaia kind of thing, but just on one island, I guess.
It's Krakoa, the mutant island.
Well, you take it for granted, but in this comic, it's just an odd thing. It still is an odd thing, a mutant island, I suppose.
It's a fun, kooky idea, but I mean, it's such a creative thing. Like, we found a really powerful mutant on the island, and then you realize it is the island. What?
True. That is again, Len Wein comes up with kind of cool ideas, but maybe the development of the idea in the comic written by Len Wein is not very sophisticated. So this mutant island just forms monsters and attacks people. And eventually we discover that the mutant island has a building, and inside the building, it's sucking the powers out of the previous X-Men that it captured. And it released Scott Summers after erasing his memory to lure in more mutants. So exactly what it gets from the mutants. And eventually it wants to take over the world. So it's just your pure evil monster. You mutate, you get intelligence, and you say, what should I do with my intelligence? Oh yeah, take over the world.
I mean,
and then they eventually defeat Krakoa in a spectacular way by creating a great thunderstorm and using Polaris's magnetic powers, powered by the electricity of the thunderstorm, to disrupt the gravity, the local gravity of the island, and send it flying off into space, which kills it.
Until it doesn't.
And then at the end, so they've rescued the X-Men and they're flying back to Professor X, and they say, what are we going to do with what was it, 16 X-Men or whatever the number is?
Yeah. Well, we'll fix that too, sweet.
I do want to mention that this Krakoa, and a lot of it resembles Ego, the Living Planet. So it's a variation on the idea that was already done by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Thor, or at least that's how my take on it. But it's still kind of a cool idea and a fun idea.
I mean, yeah, I feel like Krakoa grew into something more eventually, but in this instance, I see what you mean.
So yeah, and it in a modern comic, I guess this story could stretch over a long period of time, and the whole defying gravity and sending it out into space is done in 2 panels. And the final panel with Krakoa dying in outer space is just this teeny tiny panel. And Dave Cockrum usually puts about 8 or 9 panels on every page. A lot of very small panels.
Yeah, telling the story, moving it along. I mean, it's appreciated.
And I feel like I read this at the time, but I'm not sure.
I sure did.
I don't think I thought it was a big deal. I mean, I did not think this was the beginning of great things the first time I read this.
I could see that. It's a fun issue, but it doesn't necessarily feel momentous. But I mean, they are introducing a new team, but I don't think the weight of that hits until you're a little further along in the issues we're going to talk about.
Right. And the, you were kind of critical of the Roy Thomas writing in the X-Men that we read that kind of preceded these issues. Mm-hmm. And to me, this Roy Thomas is a far slicker professional writer of superhero stories than Len Wein is, or than early Chris Claremont is. So to me, the flow of this comic and the way the action and explanations of things unfold is very clunky.
I think we need more fun. I mean, it is clunky. You're right, but I just feel like there's a virtue in a lot of the flaws, and there's so much happening that you could be more critical of it. But I mean, when you're swept up in the motion moving along, it's like, oh man, they're fighting an island. How are they going to beat a freaking island?
Right.
Man, they booted off the planet. Like, what? There's just a kind of like a charm and a craziness to this issue that I enjoy. But I mean, if it was every comic, everything like this, I don't feel like it would be as fun. I think there's something here because they're doing so much table setting. There continues to be some table setting, and then we move on.
So the Roy Thomas comics we read were 1969, and this is 1975. I feel like writing in comics was more sophisticated, at least most comics in 1975 compared to 1969, and they're actually wordier, I believe. And I was kind of surprised to realize how wordy this was compared to Roy Thomas in 1969. But anyway, I won't belabor that point any further. I think it's kind of a likable, fun comic that you can't tell that anything special is going to come from it, I guess.
Yeah, there's nothing about the characters at this point that feels so stand out or anything. Nothing of what's to come is really born here. It just happens to be the first, I guess. And obviously, I mean, there's the assembly, but I feel like 94, we see some interesting diversion from this issue already.
94 is well, it has this incredible cover where all the X-Men seem to be either coming out of Count Nefaria's mouth or falling into his mouth. I'm not sure which. Mm-hmm. It's a cover by Gil Kane, and I have a feeling someone in the office must have adjusted where Count Nefaria's head was put so that they could show the logo or something, because I can't imagine Gil Kane drawing something where the guy's mouth is in that position with Storm over his mouth.
Yeah.
This cover, because it's such a famous comic, is one of my bugaboos. It just always struck me as a really odd cover. But that's so fair. You detect something very different in this. So this is part one of what I have read, what would have been Giant Size X-Men number 2.
Okay.
And let's double check the credits.
You're right. You're right there.
Chris Claremont, writer. Len Wein, plotter, editor. So it's their terminology is very loose. Like a writer, he literally wrote the dialogue, but he didn't plot it, or does he have something to do with the plot? It's hard to say.
I don't know, but I find these first few moments, because the first chunk of this comic is, like I said, a lot of table setting. So
first chunk now of this second issue, this number 94.
Yes, I don't know why it's second necessarily. I mean, I guess, yeah.
Second issue of the new X-Men.
Right.
I was just clarifying because I wasn't sure which issue you were talking about having table setting.
Well, they both do.
Right.
But we start right off and Sunfire's gone.
Right. Basically just, hey, I'm an angry character, so I'm leaving.
Yeah. And then there's some talk to get Banshee to stay. Some talk about the 05 leaving, except for Cyclops.
The original 5, yes.
Yeah. Except Jean Grey's back in 2 issues.
And Beast is already gone. So the ones leaving are 3 of the original 5 plus Polaris and I forget his name, Havoc.
Scott's brother, which makes that weirder.
And they're saying, well, they're grown up and they've all been trained, although really Polaris and Havoc haven't really been that trained. But again, I'm being Mr. Picky Pants.
Well, you have a point though, but it's kind of like out with the old, in with the new.
Right.
Sans a little bit.
Again, because I think it was plotted by Len Wein. It's it's on the nose, right? When he was gathering the group, he just gathered the group. When he needs to get rid of some people, he just gets rid of them. Yeah, whatever. Let me make up some reason, and they go without a whole lot of explanation. Where are they going? What are they planning? What, they're just gone. Hey, we've grown up. We're leaving. Bye.
Right. And so we suddenly have new X-Men, and our only holdover is Cyclops.
Right. Who's staying as their leader because he can't go out in the world because his eyes are too powerful.
Well, it's funny because he's the tortured mutant that can't leave because his condition makes it so he's obviously a mutant, which is funny now because he's considered one of the mutants that can go about. He just has to wear glasses. Right. But
the way Stan Lee always set him up is that his power was so great and so hard to control that at any moment he could lose it and, cut people in half all around him at the restaurant or wherever he happens to be.
Right. But it's funny as we keep going because what ultimately becomes is he becomes the straight man. And
right.
Through the issues we're going to read, he's supposed to represent the reader, the controlled guy that you want to be. And then Wolverine's kind of an antithesis to that, being like the crazy wild guy who the girls tend to go for, or whatever. Like it's just funny to see that dichotomy come up and how that kind of starts. And whereas Cyclops is just supposed to be the good puritanical guy, I guess.
It feels to me like Len Wein just wanted a superpowered leader in the field, not just Professor X sitting back at the mansion in his wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of the way in Star Trek The Next Generation, they decided to have Captain Picard and Commander Riker, so Commander Riker goes off and has the adventures. That's how I view it anyway, which ironically, since Captain Picard became Professor Xavier. But
also, I mean, Picard would often go off into the field because
they would make up excuses for it. Yeah.
Well, and there was this thing about it was the major bit of protocol he'd break, which is interesting because Professor Xavier tends to supposed to be behind, and then he'll show up in the field at times at weird points so that they can drive the dramatic tension, especially in these issues. So,
right. Well, anyway, eventually the basic plot develops that this bad guy who they've faced once before in the old days, Count Nefaria, is taking over a military nuclear missile base, and the X-Men are called in to go help out. And so they fight Nefaria and his Ani-Men, which I think are a total new invention of this issue, but they aren't explained very well.
Well, is there the older issue? But
they've appeared before?
I thought so. I thought it was in one of the older issues.
I couldn't find them. I've been looking through the older issues. I found Count Nefaria. He previously used another group of superheroes to battle the X-Men that were not at all like, they were more the standard. They were the eel and the unicorn, and they were kind of standard Marvel third tier villains.
Okay. So what I thought this was super bizarre because I'm coming to this like, oh, X-Men, but they're being called in as like a superhero group to go fight these goofball whatever against this fuddy-duddy man. This is so bizarre to me.
Yeah, they could be the Avengers at this point, right?
Yeah.
The military says,
the
hey,
D-list Avengers.
Yeah, we can't get, in fact, I think they say they can't get the Avengers. Maybe, did the Beast, in fact, put them in touch with the X-Men, maybe? Because he's now an Avenger. I need to...
Maybe you wouldn't stoop so low.
By the way, in other comics before this, Count Nefaria is a member of the Magia, the Mafia. The
Marvel Mafia that...
But for some reason, he dresses like a count from the 18th century. And is... now, for some reason, has a bunch of mutated, evolved, superpowered animals.
Did they ever do a Magia like big crossover thing? Because like at this point, who would have been in the Magia? Like the Shocker, this guy, like Hammerhead. Like,
Right.
I'm just thinking of like all the people are supposedly in this group, and I'm like, do they ever like meet and like have a summit or something? I'd love to see that. All these villains like bickering at each other, and yeah.
My take again is this was originally a Len Wein plotted giant size issue. He was just looking for some villain that no one else would care about, that he could just create an adventure, a sort of generic adventure out of.
Yeah.
But it has a certain pizzazz to it, I guess. I don't know. It's a fun enough 1970s comic book.
It just didn't feel like I was reading the X-Men at all.
Right. You're reading the Avengers. And yeah, so then the story continues in the next issue.
And it's not a hoax, not a dream. This issue, an X-Man dies.
Yes.
Which...
That's the oddest thing, actually, about this comic. But.
Well, and it's so funny because we just ditched one, and now here's, like, they're like, oh, we have too many. It's like, hold on just a second. I'm going to get rid of one, and I'm going to get rid of another one. Like,
right.
It's just so sudden. I find it funny.
Yeah. So, for those who haven't read it but are happy to be spoiled, in the second half, they get shot out of their airplane and they fall. They manage to get inside the military base and fight the Animen and against the clock, because these missiles will just go off as a security precaution if anyone takes over the base after a certain amount of time. So they're fighting in the clock, and they stop Count Nefaria, and Nefaria is escaping on an airplane, and Thunderbird kind of randomly sacrifices himself attacking the airplane, even though Banshee keeps telling him, I can stop this airplane. And so he and Nefaria blow up together. And to my knowledge, Thunderbird never came back.
Well, so what hit me about this was that Thunderbird's doing it because he like feels the need to prove himself, because he's been so cocky, and then he sees that Cyclops is leading the team and doing all this, and he's kind of stoic and cold in a bit just because he needs to manage and pull through, and he's dealing with all this nutsoid stuff. And he kind of has a bit of a realization he wants to like put up and do his bit. And then Banshee's yelling at him like, I could deal with this, but he's not really planning on like making a noble sacrifice. He's just trying to like ride out the danger and do something. So it's really foolhardy, but it's like noble at the same time. I
he
just
hasn't been very developed, right? He's
he's
Wolverine. Both he and
issues.
Wolverine kind of, make little jabs at Scott. But he's not. There's not a lot of time before he gets killed spent on it. I wonder what, since it was plotted by one person and then scripted by the other. Did Len Wein have a different explanation for what was going on here? Chris Claremont was kind of put in the position of, I've got to explain this.
Yeah, I don't know, obviously, on that end, but I just thought the way it's handled is kind of interesting, because it's almost like Thunderbird gets fridged for Scott, but his brother, I think, takes up the mantle and comes back.
Oh, he does. Okay, that rings a very faint bell.
Because there is a Thunderbird in X-Men.
Now, I saw you on Twitter calling it a fridging.
Yeah.
But it's a very minor one, because it doesn't really motivate anyone a whole lot.
Well, half the next issue is Cyclops dealing with the death of death and moving forward.
That's true. He feels terrible. But it's not like he's motivated to go fight some particular bad guy or do anything in particular. I guess it's supposed to be a moment of you're a leader of a team, and one of your members of your team dies on your watch, even though there was nothing you could do about it because it was his own foolishness.
Well, but I mean, it was a sense of morality and the sense of him needing to be a better leader, even though kind of realizing he was already doing everything, and like everybody was pushing this and it was senseless. But in a way, he feels responsible because they kind of let this someone who hadn't really proved their mettle out in the field and doing this. And I feel like if this was written at all later with any of the undertones that came to Cyclops later, this could have had a lot more impact, because there's a lot later, especially in the Bendis run, which is obviously way later, with Cyclops about the idea of him having been a child soldier. And so here you get kind of weird echoes of that, but now he's a bit older and he's the leader. And so dealing with that, I feel like could have some cool echoes, but they're not quite there yet. And
right. And in a weird way, you're jumping ahead to what Claremont does the next issue, because if you look at this issue, it's all about Professor Xavier's reaction to the death of Thunderbird.
With those nutsoid eyebrows, yeah.
Where he is psychically in the flames of, he's right there with Thunderbird when he's dying. And also Banshee is traumatized. I begged him, laddie. I pleaded with him, but he wouldn't get off the plane. He wouldn't get off. Well, and Cyclops just says, I know, Banshee, it wasn't your fault.
Right.
I suppose it had, I'm not sure who's saying this. Maybe Cyclops. I suppose it had to happen sometime. Hell, sooner or later, it happens to all of us in this business. It comes with the uniform. Now, that is kind of, especially for the younger audience at the time, that is a cool message. You know, everybody's time is limited. Because it's not something kids coming into reading superhero comics usually think about.
Well, I'm thinking
people die all the time, but they also come back. But anyway.
Well, and I think the door had just been kind of cracked for some meaningful deaths in comics. And this is interesting because they have a meaningful death here with a character that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but it's not like a long established character or anything. So you're not going to have this huge fan reaction.
My omnibus reprints the letters pages.
Oh, okay.
And so whatever issue, you know, it's many issues later, people are responding to this issue. And American Indian writes in and says how upset he is. He was so excited you had an American Indian character, and then you killed him off right away. And the bullpen, whoever writes the answers to the letters, which could be anybody, said, well, he wasn't a very good character, so we were looking around for a character to get rid of, and he seemed the best choice because he wasn't a good character. Which seemed a little insensitive to me, to the American Indian, who was so excited that there was an American Indian character in there.
Well, also, what a BS. Like, none of these characters were good yet. They hadn't had any time. Like, at this point, Nightcrawler, the most we've gotten out of Nightcrawler is a few lines and his intro. And
so I'd love to see an interview with Len Wein, say, what were you thinking when you killed off Thunderbird? Because it really wasn't Claremont who killed him off.
I mean, I really feel like it has to be shock value, right? Like, here's the X-Men. We're getting off to a boot. We're another issue in, and we're killing one of them.
Right.
Like,
well, and if I remember correctly, most of the giant size issues were quarterly. And so you, as a writer, you might be thinking, well, I should put something big in each issue because they're not coming out very often. I don't know. That's just a thought. So as you've been mentioning, in the very next issue, in number 96, to a large part, this is the first issue Chris Claremont plots and writes. So it's the first Claremontian issue, really. Right. And a lot of it is about the grieving over Thunderbird. And somehow the grieving frees a demon. I don't understand how this.
So Cyclops is out in the woods, but his eye blasts take out this
tombstone or something.
Yeah, and that's what does it. But I mean, look at that page right there. I mean, look at the face and
it's a very intense art by Chris Claremont. This is one of those times where not by Chris Claremont. Sorry, a very intense by Cockrum, Dave Cockrum. I'm all over the place with Dave Cockrum in terms of what liking or not liking his art.
And also, we should note here, plotting assist by Bill Mantlo. So, I mean, again,
interesting. So it's still kind of a group effort,
right?
I missed that. Yeah, with a welcome plotting assist from boisterous Bill Mantlo. And now Marv Wolfman is the editor rather than Len Wein, which may or may not have any significance, because I feel like Marv Wolfman was a much more character-oriented writer than Len Wein also. So this issue starts in what would be from kind of a Stan Lee, Roy Thomas way of writing, a very bad way. It starts with, let's see, like 4 or 5 pages of the character, I guess 4 pages of a character thinking and grieving with no real action going on and no real forward movement of the plot. Now, on the very last panels, we see some weird smoke cloud, which will eventually mean the demon has got out.
Right. And then we move quickly to the introduction of Moira Mactaggert.
Right. Which, again, I wonder, did Claremont and or Bill Manilow have a plan for her?
Oh, I mean...
She shows up to be their housekeeper.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Moira Mactaggert, and I have been engaged as housekeeper here by, I can't do a Scottish accent, so it seems to come out Southern, by Professor Charles Xavier. Do you want to make something of it then? And initially she becomes the romance interest of Banshee, which I didn't remember that at all.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So in this issue, eventually the demon shows up and they have a big fight with him. And that's the main plot of the issue.
And I think
instead of rushing into the plot, he's setting up Cyclops' psychological moment, spending a lot of time on that. Then he's setting up Moira Mactaggert showing up, and then no more really about that for the rest of the issue. Then he sets up a villain for later issues named, what's his name? I should know his name, but it's not appearing right here. This guy in white. Do you remember his name?
Or is that
he eventually turns out to be the guy who is reviving the Sentinels for running Project Armageddon. And I think in this, maybe it's the next issue, we're shown him killing the other people in the military who may or may not believe in his cause. Mm-hmm. What is his name?
Spacing it, sorry. But yeah,
usually they tag people by name very quickly, but
mm-hmm.
It's not Stryker, but it's something like that. So they set him up, but that's for future issues. Mm-hmm. And then to me, this fight with the demon, the whole demon thing is just kind of ridiculous. And it feels, I don't know, like Claremont doesn't yet. It's interesting to me because to me, he seems to both be setting up things for future issues, but not really having a good plot for this issue. But maybe you feel differently.
Yeah, I mean, this one is a little goofier. I don't feel like we're quite there yet. But I feel like the idea was to exercise the demons. Like, I feel like Claremont's maybe a little too on the head right now, and isn't quite to the level that he's going to get. So,
right. This is his very first fairly solo issue, and I think he's doing something based on the fact that horror comics were popular at the time. So he kind of gives this demon that shows up a kind of Cthulhu-esque thing. When Charles Xavier tries to read its mind, he sees, unimaginable horrors deep inside hell and the shatterer of souls and all that stuff.
Mm.
I think the other notable thing about this issue is we see how powerful a Storm is shown to be. Well, I guess she was also in Giant Size in a way.
Yeah, but there was something here about her standing out from the rest and able to take on the supernatural foe. I think it stands out a bit more as opposed to her power set being what's needed, because even in Giant Size, it's like her and Polaris and what's where. Here you get the sense of, oh, she's able to summon lightning kind of at will. Like, the idea of her power is a bit more shown.
And I think this is our first clue. No way would I have caught this at the time or from this issue alone, but just knowing the whole run, our first sort of clue that Chris Claremont is particularly interested in female characters. And so he wants to bring her to the fore more.
Well, and there's also that little panel there with, you see like the Shadow King and some of that and some of what's to come with her. So he clearly has some stories in mind that he's going to get to, but that wouldn't really come through yet.
Yeah. But it's an odd, I mean, I think if you were just reading it at the time, I don't know. Oh yeah. And then in the final panel, we do see how the military men who were dealing with that guy who does the Sentinels end up dead. But I think without the hindsight of knowing this is the beginning of an important run, it's kind of a mess of an issue. And yet with that hindsight, you can see the beginnings of Claremont. It amazes me that basically in his first solo issue, he's already working towards what will eventually become really good stuff.
Well, and I think, to be fair, and I thought there was a huge jump in the writing with 97, our next issue, which is really his first full solo.
I agree. So before I kind of thought about the Count Nefaria story as being not really plotted by Claremont, I thought, wow, Claremont's first 3 issues were very weak. But I can't really, now I realize I can't really blame those 2 Count Nefaria issues on Claremont entirely. And this issue seems, in a sense, from just a purely writing structure view, even weaker, like he's groping about. And yet it blows my mind that this kind of beginning writer who gets this cast-off comic is already thinking about long-term plot threads.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And I mean, we have something here in 97 that becomes this big deal, and I know where it's headed, but at the time, like, it's kooky crazy pants.
Yeah, let's go to 97, because there he really is making a huge leap, because the comic opens with Professor Xavier having a vision/dream.
Oh, that's bonkers. Sorry, I'm just looking at it, and the colors on your page versus the one I'm looking at are different.
So, well, this is let's see, how does it look in my book? I think it looks pretty close to my book. Yeah, it looks pretty much the same as it does in the omnibus. So it's probably the same files that were used in the omnibus. And you're probably looking at scans of maybe the original comic?
Yeah, that's something I wanted to touch on here too. I read some scans and I read some issues because I own a few of these issues, and I've been trying to fill out my Uncanny run to include Claremont's run. But when you start getting to this point, every issue is yeah. So I'm getting closer and closer. I'm almost through 150, and then down would be where I don't have it. So I might
have some of those I can give you. I'm really happy with this omnibus. So I think I'm going to stick with the omnibus approach to Claremont's run. I hope all of his runs in omnibuses, and maybe it isn't.
I mean, not all yet, right?
What we're talking about here is Claremont's having this vision dream where he sees insect-like spaceships battling in outer space. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, get out of my mind, all that's holy. And we know we're viewing Shiar stuff. Mm-hmm. But this is issue 97, and none of these plot threads even begin to become the major plot thread until issue 105.
Right.
So and this is a bi-monthly comic book. It only comes out 6 times a year.
Well, and I mean, now that doesn't even sound as big, but I mean, these were just rolling issues. They weren't like arcs.
Right. And these are comics back when people didn't expect long arcs, and they didn't know that they were going to buy every issue.
Right.
But this would be the first issue. If I missed this issue, I think I read those other ones at the time. This would have been the first issue where I go, oh my God, I've got to get the next issue. So it's kind of sad that I missed it. But but yeah, it blows my mind. Look, because they devote a splash page and then a double page spread. And then kind of a reaction page to this at the beginning of the story that then develops into a plot of someone mind controls Lorna. Is that her name, Lorna? Polaris, yeah. And Havoc. Someone mind controls them and has them attack the X-Men at the airport as they're saying goodbye to Professor X, who's going off on a holiday, or so he says.
And Jean's there, even though she took off earlier.
Absolutely no explanation. Jean Grey's back.
Yeah.
And
which is the better way to do it, really.
except that it undercuts the whole dramatic goodbye, Jean, kiss, we won't see each other anymore, we're being separated. That's thrown out the window by Chris Claremont because he wants the female characters in the story, I think. And he's obviously got big plans for Jean, which one sort of suspects he already is thinking about it in this issue.
Yeah, I don't know if we're quite at Dark Phoenix plotting yet, but yeah.
But Phoenix, I think he's already thinking about Phoenix.
Oh yeah, because that happens as of what, issue 101?
Yeah, when issue 101, and the events starting in the next issue are all part of setting that up. And in a sense, it was set up in the previous issue where that character the Sentinel character whose name we can't remember first shows up.
And yeah, no, I mean, there's just so much happening. It's crazy.
So it's it's a weird comic because it begins with 3 pages about a plot that is never mentioned again for the rest of the issue, which is very weird back then. Mm-hmm. And then we have Scott Summers' brother attacking him, Alex Summer attacking him along with his girlfriend Polaris. And we have a sense they're being mind controlled, but the X-Men, I don't think, or maybe they do find that out because this guy, Eric the Red, shows up.
Which is doubly weird because, as they point out, Eric the Red was a guy Cyclops did to help train the other X-Men upon the time. And so this Eric the Red popping up at Cyclops is like, what craziness.
Yeah, and the issue ends at a kind of standstill, and the bad guys, who are possibly good guys being controlled, fly off. And with a little fight between Cyclops and Wolverine. So we're getting the beginning of that. But the implication is next issue, we're going to get more about these 2 important characters who have been brainwashed and are attacking. And yet we actually won't see that for many, many issues to come. So again, this bi-monthly comic by a kind of new writer has this huge dangling plot. Mm-hmm. And actually, you can probably see on my screen here, this final panel. We see the guy who is the Sentinels guy watching them on a monitor and realize he's being watched on a monitor by someone else. I'm on issue 105 now. I still don't know who that someone else is. Do you?
Yeah.
It's a hand with almost maybe a spider symbol on it. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure.
Must be Spider Woman.
A very masculine Spider Woman hand, monitoring the evil Sentinel guy who's monitoring the X-Men. I mean, it's very striking, but I'll see as I work my way through the omnibus if they ever get back to that. But there's a huge sense, especially if you don't know that Claremont will get back to a lot of this stuff, of endless dangling threads.
Yep.
Because we have the Sentinel guy dangling. I don't think we even know he's a Sentinel guy yet, dangling from the previous issue. Now we've got Eric the Red and Polaris and Havoc and this mysterious red-handed spider guy all
And
day.
we have 3 relationships with Cyclops kind of informing the plot,
Right.
because he's our central character at this point. And we have building up with weird alliance within the team, with Wolverine kind of being the internal antagonist and
Right.
Storm backing up Cyclops and us a little bit. Like, there's team dynamics, there's the plot. Like, we were talking about how the first 2 are kind of kooky, but I mean, in this issue, like, suddenly so much more is established, and it's so much more intriguing to think about what's next.
Right. I mean, unless you really want to read the next issue by this point,
Right.
which I think will then become true for every issue after this.
Yeah. And
although there is a part of me that now that I've read up to 105 is irritated that I still know nothing about this guy with the red arm.
And I think Claremont gets better about balancing, how much is delivered at a time and how long he holds on to a thread. This is still rough, but this is the first issue that felt Claremontian to me.
I agree. So at first I was thinking, boy, it takes him a long time to become Claremont. But really, this is the second issue where he had full control, or maybe even the first issue where he had full control.
Right. And beyond that, too, like, I'm sure he's still earning his chops in some respects. And going where he was going with this, he probably had to fight some editorial bits to where they were willing to experiment.
A little bit. But it is well known that in the 70s, Marvel was a bit of a madhouse with constantly changing editors, and most writers were kind of given free rein to a much larger degree than they ever have been since. Especially compared to the way they are now, where editors really control things.
Okay.
But I'm sure, him being a newer writer, with the editor being, 3 years older than him, there was probably some discussion of what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we're probably going to go to issue number 100. We're up to issue number 98 here, which I did buy this issue as a kid because I love the Sentinels and they were on the cover. And Dave Cockrum draws the Sentinels really well, I think.
Yeah, no, these are good classic Sentinels.
Yeah. But Neil Adams drew them very well, and Jack Kirby drew them very well too. I think they're a brilliant design, which we can hand to Jack Kirby. They're just so menacing looking and disturbing, and their size difference to normal human beings is also very disturbing.
Yeah, no, there's a lot in the way their eyes are drawn and whatnot.
Their mouths, their endlessly frowning mouths. And the cover says, "The Sentinels are back, enough said." And they're right. That worked for me. I picked up this issue as a kid.
And there we go. The all new, all different.
Or does it say it on the cover? Mm-hmm. Yeah, all new, all different. Right. And that's all new. I like that. All new, all different. Because they were not all different, because now it's Jean and Scott.
Yeah, but it does feel different with them kind of being the head of it all. And if you move forward a couple pages, we get a fun little insert.
This one? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Because it's almost like a title where the Sentinels have returned.
I was talking about Jack Kirby and Stan Lee being in those top two pages.
Right. That was odd. Jean and Scott are kissing, and Jack and Stan are just wandering behind them. And of course, at this point, Jack and Stan were not friends. But Jack says, "Hey, Stan, you know who they were? I tell you, they never used to do that when we had the book. Ah, Jack, these young kids, they got no respect." Which I don't think Jack and Stan would be too upset about the two of them kissing after all these years, but who knows?
Right. It was a fun little to do.
Well, I think this the panel at the bottom of the same page so much gets my attention. I think it's a great comic book moment where the Sentinels announce themselves as they rip their way through a wall. "It can't be them, not them. But it is. Prepare to face your doom, mutant, for the Sentinels have returned. So even though they're emotionless robots, they like grand entries.
I mean, they're boisterous. It's fun.
Now, one thing is, well, other than the demon, so far we're getting kind of recycled plots, right? We're getting Count Nefaria returning. We're getting, a battle with Havoc and this Eric the Red person, and now we're getting the Sentinel. So maybe there is where, maybe by choice or there, Claremont is getting instructions, tie this into the X-Men that the previous fans of the X-Men will know. Even though most of the characters are new, the villains are all familiar.
Maybe. Although there's a twist on the Sentinel idea that I feel like they wanted to set up the classic to have the big reveal that leads into 100. So
yes. So this issue involves a lot of fighting with the Sentinels. Oh, there's a really cool panel where Sentinel is being blasted by Scott right out of a building. I think this is one of Cockrum's better issues, maybe just because has so much fun drawing the Sentinels.
Yeah.
And so a number of the X-Men get kidnapped by the Sentinels, and at the end of this issue, we see them escaping. Only when they escape, they discover the Sentinel base that they're escaping from is in outer space. So the issue ends with them looking like they're going to asphyxiate in outer space.
Right.
So that's quite a cliffhanger. And then the other interesting thing about the issue is we find out that Professor X's holiday is... well, it's interrupted by the Sentinels also, but Professor X's holiday is with a leading astronomer who's trying to figure out the images he's been seeing in his visions and where that star system might be. So we get that thread continued a little bit.
Though, in some ways, I do still feel like we're playing with X-Men as the D-list Avengers rather than like representatives of the mutant community.
Right.
Which... it works a little better here because we're building relationships and there's more direct connection, but it's still kind of building to the way I think of X-Men.
Right. Well, because you think of X-Men as existing in this world of mutants, whereas the old idea of the X-Men, which is still the main thread here, is the X-Men are a superhero team who are mutants. And so one of their many problems is the mutant issue, like the Sentinels coming to get them. But they have other adventures and heroics, and their main goal is to be a team of superheroes who save the world every now and then.
Right.
And fight bad guys. Although even if you look at those issues you didn't like by Roy Thomas, there was Sentinels, which led them to a mad scientist who was helping them out because was supposed to be sympathetic to mutant problems. And then they go to the Lost World, the world of dinosaurs, Khazar's world, and they encounter Magneto, who's making new mutants, so to speak, creating, mutating the cavemen and other people who live in the Lost Land. So that thread of it being about mutants was, in my opinion, again, already being developed by Roy Thomas near the end of his run.
In a way, sure, but there's kind of a method mode when you get to Claremont once he's hit his stride, and we're not quite there yet. And so I don't know, it feels different. It's still just a different era.
It's still building on the past. I mean, you like to think it's a break from the past. I like to think it's a continuation of what was already being built, perhaps more haphazardly than Chris Claremont did. But
yeah, it is a continuation. And eventually moves and evolves in a different way and becomes that. But in order to become where I'm thinking of the X-Men more, it takes years of building.
Right. Which is amazing that one creator got a chance to do years of building, and that from the very beginning he was starting to weave in threads that could be built upon. Again, in a world where comics usually pretty much concluded by the end of the issue, especially if it's a bi-monthly comic, they might have some two-part stories, and they might have some soap opera threads that continued for years, but the bigger plot threads usually wrapped up very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But this guy, Dr. Lang, that's his name. He's kind of interchangeable for Trask, who the originator of the or Trask's son, who appeared in those issues we talked about in our previous episode.
Right.
He's just a bad guy. In fact, he's more of a bad guy. Like Trask's son had this wanting to revenge his dad and then turning out to be a mutant himself. This guy, Dr. Lang, he's just evil. He just wants to destroy mutants, and he's happy to kill any humans who get in his way for that.
Yeah.
And somehow he has a outer space lair, hideout. It's kind of James Bondian, I guess.
And what's funny is you're relating this to the older stuff that we read, but in a lot of ways, this is also very similar to the Hoxpox story we read. You know, they're in space dealing with the robots, with, you know, these evil robots that are doing whatever.
Right. And Roy Thomas sent the robots off into space in their previous appearance. Although they went to the sun. So I mean, this is kind of a little bit of a nod, although apparently these are a different set of Sentinels that Dr. Lang has made, and they're not as intelligent as the previous Sentinels for some reason. So I'm thinking those previous Sentinels who went to the sun are going to come back somewhere, but I don't know enough. I can't pull all the threads together.
I mean, Sentinels keep getting built in different various forms throughout, so
yeah. I like that the X-Men that are captured escape themselves because no one knew what, this Dr. Lang and his Sentinels did not know what Wolverine's powers were. And so he was able, I don't know why he waited so long, but he was able to cut through his metal bonds with his adamantium claws.
Well, because he had to go into that berserker rage.
Ah, right. Jean had to get slapped by evil Dr. Lang, and then Wolverine was ready to escape.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, Wolverine doesn't yet have adamantium. I can't say that word. Adamantium claws, or they've never said, or maybe they say that in Hulk 181. I don't know.
I don't.
So I'm still not clear what his powers are, other than he has these claws that can cut through metal. And I get we may have been told that he can smell things like an animal, or we may not have been told that yet.
He's hairy.
Anyway, it's a fun scene when he breaks away and foils the villains. Lots of good fighting against the.
But it's funny because he's still a bit player.
Right. Well, they're all a bit players, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's hard to.
Well, except for really, Cyclops.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and it did catch me by surprise that they were in outer space.
Oh yeah, no, it's
in the cliffhanger.
Well, and I like that too, because too often now we have characters running off into space and it doesn't feel like much of anything. But here, the idea of them being in space is fantastical and fun, and there's more weight to it.
Yeah. Now I think I've lost in my on my screen share. I think I've lost the next comic.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, we're not going to really end it out because these stories keep rolling from one story to the next. So we don't have really a definitive endpoint. But The big twist ultimately is that these new X-Men need to fight the old X-Men, but the old X-Men are like Sentinel versions of themselves.
Right. So yeah, in the issue, issue 99, Death Star Rising, we basically get a lot of fighting the Sentinels, and concluding with a splash page of X-Men versus X-Men to the death, where we see the old X-Men facing off the new X-Men on this space station.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's also the cover of X-Men 100, although Professor X is also there. And eventually we discover there are a bunch of X-Men robots,
Mm-hmm.
which again kind of has a feel of what the older X-Men were, the older Marvel comics in general. You face off against people who aren't really that. Oh, that's weird. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my. There we go. What's that? Sometimes when you click on these issues, you can read the Marvel Unlimited, and sometimes it forgets that there's a Marvel Unlimited. So from a historical point of view, it's not really very important that they fight robots of themselves. It's really what happens at the end of the issue when they're escaping and Jean Grey sacrifices herself to get everyone else gets in the shielded part of the space, the spaceship, and she goes in the part that's being exposed to the sunspots or the sun storm.
Mm-hmm.
And gets, potentially dead.
Mm-hmm. Deadified.
So, and of course, we all know, unless you don't know, that that's the beginning of her death and rebirth as the Phoenix.
Right.
So it feels like I don't know. I would love Claremont to have written a chapter by chapter notes of all of these books now. It feels like he knew for many issues that he was heading towards turning Jean Grey into the Phoenix.
I mean, I think he did, because we get there pretty quickly thereafter. It's fun to have these characters that are doing these different things, and to me, this is such an enjoyable thing to come back to, and I kind of just wanted to keep going for a bit, but I'm in the middle of another long read through. But this is like the protos of where I really started enjoying X-Men, and the public did too. So it's really cool to come back to this and see how, in a lot of ways, how very modern it was, but also how it was kind of setting the footprint for how comics would be.
It's also very
stumbling.
modern in a lot of ways.
Oh, that's true too.
So many caption boxes of description. And I don't know, a large part of these fight scenes is just fight scenes to have fight scenes, right? There's not the whole bad guy in this sequence of 3 issues is that Dr. Lang, and there's nothing to him. He's just evil he hates mutants, and that's it.
Right.
And their defeat of him just feels, everything about their battle with him feels generic. It's the visuals are cool.
That's
Dr.
true.
Lang dies because he's in this hovercraft shooting at them, and then he crashes into a wall. And that's the end of him. I don't know if he ever came back.
I'm sure he does.
Does this character, this physicist who helped them go into space, does he show up more?
Well, he was a Hulk supporting character, wasn't he?
Or was he? Oh, I didn't recognize him.
Yeah.
Later on or in the past?
Well, I thought he was the one with Xavier on the boat.
Yeah, he is the one with Xavier on the boat, and then he's connected to NASA, so he helps them get in a spaceship so they can go up and rescue the other X-Men on the space station.
Well, I don't know. I just know he's off from the Hulk too. So there's more of a Hulk X-Men connection at this time than you'd think. I mean, with Wolverine and him.
I wish I could remember his name so I could look him up, because I just don't remember anything about it.
And then in a handful of issues, they're fighting the Wendigo. So,
yeah. Which that ties back to the Hulk and Wolverine, I guess.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, it's still, so there's this, to me, there's this sophistication of interesting threads, and the character bits are just beginning to be dropped. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of rawness and amateurness, almost, even, again, like I say, compared to the Silver Age writing. It's clumsy, and it's like it's feeling its way around, in my opinion.
No, it is. I mean, it's not quite fully baked yet, but we're seeing it kind of come to fruition, and there's something fun with that. Whenever you see some of these big creators and you kind of watch them go through their work and you watch them improve as creators, it's really interesting, and it's harder usually to see that in a writer. But here we're seeing some of that, and it kind of comes through. Yeah. And it's fun to read.
Right. And knowing what we know, it makes it particularly fascinating.
Right.
But it seems just like an amazing gamble, because at any moment, Chris Claremont could have been taken off this book, and then all of these threads would have just never had any meaning, or would have had some much less meaningful meaning.
Yeah, I'm guessing he probably felt some confidence because the X-Men wasn't a property anybody would want at this point. Mm-hmm. And if he was given a chance to kind of build it up, and he did, it became this whole other thing. And so he did the right thing. In a way, he did what Adams was trying to do, was take that least popular property and build it up into the biggest thing through his creative genius.
Right. And Adams came in as a star, whereas Claremont came in as, no one really cares. You're the office assistant. Why don't you take over this thing we're too busy to work on, and it's not important. So it looks like it only became monthly in issue 112 in August 1978. Mm-hmm. And it started in 75. So there were 3 or possibly 3.5 years of it just being a bi-monthly, which meant it was a very, very edge case book.
Well, and it could well be that the creative talent on it were split between other duties, so they weren't looking at trying to do it until it became more of a success. So every inch was earned.
Everything was by the sales figures back then, right? It wasn't decided on by editorial.
Right.
So if it was selling well, they would make it by a monthly. If it was selling badly, but they thought it had some chance, they would let it run bi-monthly for a while. Like when Frank Miller started on Daredevil, it was bi-monthly, also a similar case in the sense of a book that no one cared about, so he could redo it any way he wanted.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
So when did you, I seem to remember your starting point might have been with Jim Lee X-Men. Is that right?
I mean, that was my first X-Men comic. Yeah. Which was some of Claremont's last for a while until he came back.
But when he came back, there was a lot less attention on his work.
A lot less.
Because did he come back while Grant Morrison was doing his run or something like that?
I think it was like just following. And the X-Men had just had Austin on it, which is considered one of the worst runs of X-Men. And then Claremont came back on.
Did he come back on the main X-Men title or on a different X-Men title?
On Uncanny, and he introduced X-23 in there. and there's some notable stuff, but it just didn't. I don't know. I didn't realize it was that until I started collecting Uncanny again. So it's interesting.
So you went from the end of Claremont's run to, you mentioned you read Giant Size when you were a kid. Did you go back and were there? I guess there probably were already trades of these old issues. Did you go back? How did you end up reading X-Men #1 Giant Size?
Well, so I wanted to read Giant Size X-Men #1 before I knew what trades were or anything. And at my comic shop, there was this, what I found out was a reprint. At the time, I didn't really care. It was just this comic I wanted. It probably cost like $8 or something, which to me at the time was a fortune.
Yes.
But I wanted that one. So I got it. I think I got it at a bit of a discount because they were just being nice to me. And it's been in my collection forever. This old reprint. It has like a silver frame around the cover that says Marvel Milestone Edition, and that's been the copy I had. I looked it up not too long ago, and that reprint in of itself is worth $60 or something.
Oh wow, impressive for a reprint.
Yeah.
So because probably the print run was for the day not that big on Giant Size X-Men.
Right.
So then from there, how did you get to read these other issues, or
I haven't read them before. We're preparing for
so this is your first time,
except for I read was it 94? And I think I read 94 recently, like a few months ago, because at a Black Friday sale, my comic shop was selling older, bigger issues for half off whatever they were in the bin. And that issue, the copy I got that was, a reader copy, it cost me like $6 or something. I thought, oh, here's some old Claremont issue of X-Men. Cool. I'm definitely going to grab that for $6, whatever. I bring it home, look up. I'm like, this is the first Claremont issue. What? How did I land that? And so I read through that a while ago, and I've read a few smatterings of issues as I've been slowly amassing them. I recently made a big push to try to get more of my Claremont, because right now I'm at this point where I have this kind of Swiss cheese stuff in the early numbers, and I really want to try to track down a handful of more issues, because then I'll be able to read starting at one random issue and just go. And then I have Uncanny up until around 460 something.
But you have read the Dark Phoenix saga before, right?
Multiple times, yes.
So where did you pick up? Around this issue, 101, or a little later?
Well, Dark Phoenix isn't until much, much later.
Well, I know the actual Dark Phoenix, but once you start reading Dark Phoenix, then you say, well, what about all this other stuff?
Yeah, I have a Rebirth of Jean Grey trade as well, but I kind of had trades in a few random issues, but I haven't read a lot of it, and I've been wanting to, so I've been pushing for it recently.
Well, this was a lot of fun, and I'm just going to keep going. I mean, I have the first 2 omnibuses, so
how far does that go?
I don't have the second omnibus in front of me, unfortunately. The first one goes to issue 131 from 1980. So I think it has the beginning of the Dark Phoenix saga, and then you had to get the rest. You get the actual meat of the Dark Phoenix saga in the beginning of the next omnibus.
41. That's weird. It looks like your second omnibus goes to issue 153.
Right, and then I'm not sure if there is a next omnibus after that. So these things include these omnibuses include the
there is
letters pages, which include the yearly statement of circulation. So by issue, by issue 131, which is somewhere in the Dark Phoenix saga, the total paid circulation was 162,000, which, you know, is way more than comics now, but it's not as much as I thought it would be.
Yeah, I don't know.
And I can't find it. In one of these early issues that we've just read, they give the circulation also. These things always fascinate me.
It's interesting to see what's considered a success and what isn't at different times. I mean, It's crazy because this all builds eventually to the biggest selling single issue of any comic of all time.
Right. But people often think that all of the comics from the Bronze Age were selling, 300,000 copies. And even in its early peak days, it was 163. And so, this one's flipped the other way. Excuse me. So back in the early 70s, in 98. So early in the rerun of this, the revival of this comic, it was selling 119,000 copies on average. And you got to remember, to sell 119,000 copies, they had to print 266,000 copies. So they had to end up printing and shipping out all these copies that then ended up getting trashed to sell those 119,000.
Why would they trash them? I need them now.
I know. Well, I think they used to have the newspaper sellers or the stores rip off the covers and mail them back.
Oh, yeah.
And later they would just have them trim off the top part that showed the title and the number. And there was a store when I was a kid in Middletown, Connecticut, called the Printer's Devil, which is actually a printing term. A printer's devil is something in printing. But at the Printer's Devil, in the back rooms, they had all these coverless comics for sale for like 5 cents a piece. It was totally illegal.
Well, there you go.
But that's how that system worked. So, in a general rule of thumb is whatever the paid circulation was, the print run was twice that, at least. And in this case, at least in the early X-Men, it was more than twice that. So that was and apparently, like, by the Jim Shooter era of Marvel, when Marvel was doing well, they were not necessarily selling more copies than DC, but they were having a better sell through. They were not having to trash as many individual issues. So anyway, that was a big part of the economics of comics back then, which when people talk about, back then they sold 200,000 copies an issue, and if it was at 150, they would cancel it. The economics were entirely different. It was in the returnable economy.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak to any of that, but that's pretty crazy. I'm just getting mad
the
now.
comic shops saved them, because they could just print the number that they would actually sell, and that saved them huge amounts of money.
That just makes me even more mad now, because I want most of those issues and I can't. Yeah. They're pricey. I'm sure there's more out there.
Coverless copies are out there somewhere.
Ugh, no, that's unacceptable.
Coverless copies are very depressing somehow.
Oh, it's horrible.
But I got a lot of comics that way as a kid. I mean, I couldn't afford much, but I could afford a nickel.
All right. Well, there you go.
Okay, well, so Jean Grey is dead, but she will be back, as we will be. And next time we're going to read, assuming it's still your choice, the first story arc, I guess, of Michael J. Straczynski on Spider-Man. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Do you happen to remember off the top of your head the numbers of those?
It is Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, issues 30 through 35.
Okay. So if you want to read along with us, you've got that to do. So, thanks for sticking with us. I have a feeling this was a long one.
Yeah.
But we had a good time.
Yeah, it was great.
So, we'll be back.
Cheers, everybody. Boop. All right. Save.
Yeah, it looks like about an hour and 45 minutes or something.
Yeah.
Phew.
Cut that down a little bit, but yeah. How do I say?
Anything you want to say to our YouTube listeners or watchers before we go?
Oh, you
guys are the important ones.
The best ones. I don't know. If you guys have any interest in 90s Green Lantern, I'm going to be talking a bit about that more coming up.
On your channel, Wednesday Serial?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully I'll remember to link to Wednesday Serial down below.
Hopefully. And I mean,
good to hear that there will be more Wednesday Serial. We've been lacking in that area.
Yeah, well, I mean, the last bit we did with Emerald Dawn, it tied into all that.
Right. But you still are not following my advice. Hold up the damn covers.
It's so many. I'm going through
visual medium. You know what happens to me? I'm listening to you and I glance over. Oh, wait, which issue is he talking about? And I don't know. If you're holding it over, I know what issue you're talking about. Well, I know it's a lot of exercise.
Well, so the next one I'm going to be doing is going to be going through over 50 issues. So I'm like,
yeah, but if you have on your last video, I could see you were looking down at the comic book you were talking about.
Well, that's for me.
I wanted to see it.
Well, I can't be bothered.
This is my old man nagging you.
Oh, it's totally
Uncle
fair.
Damian complaining to you.
100% right.
But your video, I still enjoy them a lot, and I think of you as having a lot more interesting insights into everything you read than I do, or than the average person does. I consider myself the person who has to make things a little more concrete so that you can spin off the more interesting theories. Although I don't know if you did that in this episode or not, but in general.
Well, to me, this is just there's so much of a hearkening of what's to come, right? But in the issues themselves, I was like, it's kookier, it's older, it's fun, but yeah, like you were pointing out, like the villains were not as well baked, and there's some fun ideas here, but we also know where they're going. It's more the historical artifact, but also I feel like there's a quality in it that's growing, even through we only went through a handful of issues. You see the quality of it grow so quickly, so fast.
You really do.
And that was more of what I got out of these issues. I didn't have as many insights, which, I didn't even bring this up. I follow this account called the Claremont Run, which is, I believe, a Canadian-funded small group going through the Claremont Run. They do these graphs of
this is, when you say account, do you mean on YouTube or a podcast or a website?
It's on Twitter. So they do a tweet every day, generally.
Oh.
They're talking about doing some quick YouTube videos soon. But so much of what they talk about comes later. And there you go. And notably to me, that's somewhat annoying, is they talk about the problematic elements of Storm a lot. And I'm like, hey, bite me.
So the problem with Twitter is you're always starting in the present. It would be a lot of work to roll back. The nice thing about podcasts or YouTube is you can go watch the first issue or the first episode.
Right.
The first episode.
I actually tweeted them when I early found them and said, you guys are doing a lot of great work. It would be a lot better if you posted a lot of these ideas as blogs instead of as tweets. Because it just doesn't, what you're doing and the work of what you're doing versus the format of ethically going into Twitter just doesn't make sense. And they're like funded.
Really?
Yeah,
For doing this Twitter being the main thing they do.
Yeah, they have some sort of literary grant, apparently.
Wow. Are they Canadian? They get much better grants in Canada than here.
I believe, yeah, they are. So.
Oh, that's a lot to read. Okay, well, so they have a website. That might be a better way to.
There's not much on the website.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Never mind then.
I mean,
I love these covers that they show here. I mean, in a way, I think now I wish this was on the podcast. You talk about the Avengers, and I talk about the Legion of Superheroes, and what both of those had was lots of colorful characters and the potential excitement of that. You know, the Avengers was the first comic I ever bought because there were so many superheroes on the cover. And I feel like the X-Men is the only thing that really delivered on that promise of all these colorful characters and wild adventures and stuff the way we as readers would have hoped for it. You know, there's hints of good stuff. Well, I guess Eric will never hear that. There's hints of great moments in the Legion, but it never comes fully into fruition. And the X-Men is that exception to the rule where the potential actually develops and comes out.
I'm glad you said it this time and not me.
Luckily, Eric only listens to the podcast, and this part's not being recorded.
Oh, phew, we're safe.
Because I want Eric to love me still.
Yeah.
But that just popped into my head just looking at these covers, and there's something so satisfying compared to other superhero group comics. And as an adult, I stopped liking, even as a younger reader. I think by the time I was 13 or 14, I stopped buying the group comics. I bought the individual ones because those were more interesting.
I mean, generally, I think I'd agree with you, but I feel like there's something about the development and move through the X-Men that
well, that's what I'm saying. The X-Men are the exception to that.
Yeah.
They live up to the dream of the group comic that no one else has really quite mastered.
Well, X Factor did a good job.
Well, okay.
Yeah, no,
Spin-offs of the X-Men have been good.
Yeah.
You know, the Justice League, weak stuff for me. The Teen Titans, closer. They had some really good moments, but over the longer haul.
I mean, for a while, Teen Titans was like the rival book, right?
Right. And they were clearly created or envisioned to go up against the X-Men.
Well,
and
when
for
it was
a while, they were a good rival.
When it was the all-new Teen Titans, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And they even had that crossover book.
Right. Well, and it's interesting to see that Marv Wolfman was an early editor, and then early editor of Chris Claremont's on the X-Men, and then he went on to make the Competitor.
He wasn't editing; he was just cribbing notes.
Well, editors hardly do anything, right?
I have no idea. I do not understand where the line is for editors and how that works.
I think editing is a kind of thing that can be almost anything. It could be just a person who takes the material you offer and makes sure it gets into production. It could be a person who collaborates with you on a deep level. It could be a person who gets in your way creatively and represents the company's wishes in some unpleasant manner.
Yeah. I've heard stories running the gambit, so
yeah. And I haven't worked with editors in comics, but I've worked with editors in a variety of settings. But like one editor, the only thing he did on one of my pieces of fiction was add italics all over the place. Another editor said, I would buy this story if you could improve the ending. And I spent a month thinking about it, and I changed the middle of the story. And he said, you did a great job improving the ending. I'm going to buy the story now.
That reminds me. When When I was much younger, I wrote a 6-page script for a comic to appear in an anthology. And it was with this female character and her sword, which in retrospect was kind of like Katana, but I never heard of Katana before.
Katana's a cool idea that's never been done well in the actual comics. So it
Yeah,
should be
well,
redone.
I wouldn't say
Your
I did
brilliance has changed it all. Yeah.
But
anyway, so you did this you said 6-page.
I had to edit it because they said, "Oh, we already had someone with the sword. Can you make it a different weapon?" I said, "Can I make it a knife?" And they said, "Sure." And I'm like, "Okay, it's a short sword, whatever." And I just rewrote the action scenes to kind of fit that, and did a search and replace for the word sword and put knife. And
imagine if someone had said to Conan, "Well, we already have a character with a sword. You need a different weapon."
Wouldn't that have been Null getting the different weapon?
Well, I just mean when Conan was first published in the 30s, King Arthur has a sword. This guy Conan has a sword too. Let's change that.
There are too many characters with swords as a rule.
Swords are kind of your basic weapon, though.
Are they?
Before guns.
They were the weapon of nobility in Japan and whatnot during the
the weapon of the Roman army back in 200 BC.
Yeah. Well, since we're semi-public, I wanted to issue kind of a semi-apology to you.
Okay.
I barred us from talking about Spider-Man for a while.
Oh, yes. Well, that's because you have a whole nother podcast about it.
Right. And so we're breaking that here. And I was just going to say, if there's good reason for us to look at a Spider-Man story for any reason you want to talk about it, let's just go for it.
Well, we have a history of looking at Spider-Man, but not on the podcast. We did, I don't know how many episodes about Mysterio, probably 3.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that. And those were kind of proto Never Stay Dead. It was very much the same thing. Just
we did a lot of videos before Never Stay Dead.
Oh yeah.
I still fondly remember when we talked about Tom Strong.
Wow, that was a long.
We did a whole Animal Man series. We covered the entire Grant Morrison run.
Yeah.
All this stuff we've done that's lost in the mists of time.
Yeah, go look for that, people. If you care.
All the people who've been watching for 2 hours now and are still watching.
I mean,
64-page special, basically. Who's already watched those?
Right, yeah.
Our best friend. I should pay him money to edit the videos and make them interesting.
That would be something.
He's a talented guy, but a bit scary. He's so obsessed with breasts. Who knows?
Who can blame him?
Sorry?
Who can blame him? They're enticing.
Well, true. The rest of us just keep it undercover.
Yeah, right.
At least after we're 30. Let's see. Well, I think maybe we'll end the live stream or the quote live stream. Yep. Thank you, 64-page special, for watching to the end, and anyone else who made it.
Let us know.
Now we'll know if I think he's a great guy, so he may or may not have the time to make it all the way through. But good night, everyone. I had to go